of living in an abusive marriage 25 years ago. The memories began to return as I listened to a survivor of domestic violence tell her story at the vigil that First Parish co-hosted. As MC and tech host for the event, my mental focus had been elsewhere until the survivor started to speak. Then suddenly, I was back again in my mid-20s, married to a man who undermined my sense of self by what he said and what he did not say. That's when I began to write this sermon in my head. How do we relate to the painful parts in our history? For a long time, I simply wanted to forget the pain of that period of my life. And for months, even years, the pain receded, tucked behind the fullness of my day-to-day life. When the memories appeared this time, I noticed a shift in my response. Instead of wishing to hide from the pain, I tried to look at it, to feel it, to acknowledge it. Instead of wishing to forget, I wished for a deeper healing, even if it meant remembering. Healing often includes remembering, doesn't it? And yet to heal does not necessarily mean that you move forward unchanged. As author Annie Lamott writes, you will lose someone you cannot live without, and your heart will be badly broken. And the bad news is that you never completely get over the loss of your beloved. But this is also the good news. They live forever in your broken heart, and that doesn't seal back up. And you come through. It's like having a broken leg that never heals perfectly, that still hurts when the weather gets cold. But you learn to dance with a limp. I know many of us know how to dance with limps, acquainted as we are with heartbreak and loss. There are no rules for how to respond to heartbreak and loss, no one right path for how to move forward. Haven't we all witnessed a range of responses to grief and loss and hard times? For some, it's important to keep the struggle front and center, naming it, processing it, not forgetting. Yet for others, the pain needs to be set aside at times, compartmentalized to be able to function day to day without being overwhelmed. Still others may seek to place the pain fully out of view and only look ahead, never looking back, or perhaps looking back years later when it finally feels safe to do so. For most situations, I have come to believe that to heal, we all must look back eventually. I believe this is true for personal griefs, as well as for the painful memories we share with others in families, communities, and nations. Looking back to heal led Jabari Jones to explore the roots of their African ancestry. Citing the idea of Sankofa from the Akan tribe in Ghana, Jones embraces reaching back in history in order to reconnect and to heal from the intergenerational trauma connecting their African ancestors to their own life today as a, quote, black, queer, 40-something, non-binary person residing on unceded Abenaki land in Vermont. Jones recounts how they read books on Black history and whiteness, trying to make sense of their history that connects their present with their ancestral past. In response, Jones writes, "One thing I've learned is that at the core of white privilege is the entitlement to amnesia and ignorance, to forget that America was founded on stolen land, stolen labor, and genocide, and that we live in a society structured by this history, is to embrace an identity rooted in a false innocence and a flight from truth and healing. What does it mean when a culture collectively selects to forget, to feign ignorance, to avoid the painful parts of history? Currently, there is a debate in our nation about critical race theory. Proponents of critical race theory understand it to be a tool for analyzing how the social construct of race has functioned in our social system. In other words, it is a descriptive and critical tool of how society has used the idea of race to create different opportunities and experiences for people. Opportunities and experiences that are markedly unequal. Critics of critical race theory denounce it as an attempt to make white-identified folks feel bad about themselves, seeking to sever the link between the past and the present. Critics distance themselves from the undeniable racial injustice of a past that contains slavery, genocide, and violent oppression. Admittedly, my own doctorate in religion, gender, and culture, and my academic background is deeply grounded in critical race theory. And it has been odd to me to see what I experienced as academic theory fiercely debated on TV news shows, newspaper headlines, and legislative bodies. Watching, I have been thinking not only of theories of social structure and transmission of cultural knowledge, but also about the human response to painful memories. How do we relate to the painful parts in our personal and our cultural history? When I consider the debates around critical race theory, what strikes me is that our culture is debating whether or not we want to look back at the painful parts in our history in order to heal. And like our response to personal pain, we have different responses. Some are trying hard to not look back, to emphasize only the future. Others, like Jones, are saying we can move forward only by looking back, by understanding those linkages between the past and the present. Of course, looking back to painful parts of history is neither simple nor easy. The nature of time means that we cannot go back and simply fix the problems. We cannot tell a loved one not to get in the car to avoid the accident. We cannot decide to wait a bit longer before marrying to make sure about the other person. We cannot stop the introduction of Jim Crow laws. We have to put Kleenex back in here, lay ministers. Oh, sorry. I knew adding the line about the accident would make me think of David. So, one second. I think of David, and I look at your faces out here, and I know, and I think of many of those we've lost. And we can't go back. We can't go back to fix those choices. And we can't go back to fix things like Jim Crow laws. We cannot intervene to assist treaties with Indigenous tribes are just and held up. We cannot keep the boat from landing in Jamestown in 1619 and beginning a wretched legacy of enslavement. Time keeps us here, now. But does our helplessness at fixing the past mean we should not look back? What is gained when we look back? What shifts when we follow the principle of Sankofa to return and retrieve what we need? For example, why does it matter that we go back to the first Thanksgiving and reconsider, relearn what happened and why 400 years ago this year? Living as we do in New England, this story has often been a familiar one of happy gratitude for a successful harvest and a foothold begun in the New World. With pilgrim hats and feathered headdresses made of construction paper, children reenact the story in schools as their parents and grandparents have done. I mean, who among us has not traced our hand on a piece of paper and colored in the feathers to make a turkey? And while it is a good thing to be grateful for food, for family, for chosen family, we are increasingly becoming aware that doing so beneath the banner of the Pilgrim's story is problematic. Because what we know now is that that little colony in Plymouth also marks the beginning of centuries of loss for the Wampanoag, for the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, the Pawtucket, and in time for countless other indigenous peoples across this continent who lost their land and their lives to white European settlement. Remembering this painful history, Thanksgiving has become a national day of mourning for many indigenous peoples. So how do we reconcile the loss and pain of indigenous nations with the reality that our very presence here today as a congregation was begun by white European settlers? By white European settlers we laud as founders, and for some of us, as our biological ancestors. If you had hoped I would offer an answer, I must disappoint. The only answer I have is the sense that healing will only happen when we look back, even or especially to the painful moments. Only then do we begin to acknowledge the fullness of history. Only then are we able to start grasping the history held by others, histories, stories, and experiences we may not have known or been taught. Such explorations are hard and painful. I am not surprised that people resist doing so, both in their personal lives and in the cultural level. And yet, increasingly, I fear what happens if we do not honestly appraise the past. What cost will we pay for feigned innocence, for the white entitlement of amnesia? I believe the work of deepening our understanding of whiteness, of committing ourselves to anti-racism, of seeking to build real relationships with indigenous nations and people of color remains critical work for all of us, especially those of us who identify as white. While such work is certainly politicized in our nation right now, at its core, I understand this work to be an expression of our religious values, to respect the inherent worth and dignity of every person. To be anti-racist, anti-oppression, is to be pro-human, pro-justice. And to do this work can be painful, just as it is painful anytime we choose to face loss and pain and feel its impact. But we are not alone in this work. As a congregation, we pledge to care for one another and to work together for a better world. I challenge all of us to reconsider just what that might mean for us today as individuals, as a congregation, and as a nation. Perhaps if we join in looking back, we might also find a new way forward into a more just future for Black lives, for indigenous nations, and for all who face ongoing oppression. So may it be. Amen.